she noticed two hefty men standing before her. One was strikingly handsome, dressed in fine, expensive fabrics that Ije had never seen before. The men were startled at the sight of Ije. She was dressed in an animal skin, her hair so long and untamed, but still her beauty was undeniable. She looked at them strangely, never batting an eye. The handsome one, dressed in fine clothing, looked at her with wide eyes. She must be a god or deity, or maybe even a ghost, he whispered. Long time ago, somewhere in the western parts of Africa, lay a big village called Ata. The village was not only big, it was prosperous. Their soil was rich, and their harvest always bountiful. They were surrounded by lush green trees and bordered by the great Azuzu forest, where wild animals wandered, and no one dared to enter for fear of being devoured by the wild animals. Unlike the other neighboring villages, the people of Ata not only prospered, they were united and lived in peace. But one day, something happened. In this village lived a happy family, loved by many. Mazi Udenze and his wife, Egondo, had experienced a peaceful life despite their struggles with fertility. They waited patiently, hoping the gods would bless them with children. Mazi was a well-respected man, known for his generosity and for owning one of the largest barns in Ata. His wife, Egondo, was the epitome of beauty. Before marrying Udenze, she was the dream of every man in the village. Whenever she went to the stream to fetch water, or even to the bush to get firewood, young men would flock to her, offering their assistance, but she would always decline their advances. She never gave any of them much thought. The only man she longed to be with in her heart was Udenze. Udenze was a successful young man in his own right. He worked diligently on his father's farm. Even as a boy, he surpassed his father's yam growing skills. And when his father fell ill, he took over the farm, and within 2 years, his impressive harvests astounded the villagers. Young women admired him, yet he remained focused on Egondo, the only woman he had ever wanted. Whenever Udenze had a break from his work, he would sneak over to Egondo's father's farm, hiding until he spotted her collecting firewood. Then he would run to her aid, offering to carry the heavy bundles home. Egondo had grown fond of Udenze because he had always been there for her since their childhood. And as they grew older, their bond deepened. She would hold Udenze's tools while he shouldered her firewood, admiring his strength and masculinity. She liked hard-working men, and Udenze embodied that ideal. Gradually, her interests in other young men faded, and her heart became wholly devoted to Udenze. A few years later, the young lovebirds have become husband and wife. And despite the absence of a child, Udenze and Egondo found joy in each other's company, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They walked hand in hand to the farm each day, to the admiration of all, both old and young alike, and chattered as if they had no care in the world. "Do you think these yams will be ready for harvest next week?" Udenze asked, glancing at the lush green plants swaying in the breeze. Egondo chuckled softly, her eyes sparkling with affection. "With the care we've given it, I have no doubt. Just imagine the taste of your favorite porridge yam." Their laughter filled the air, blending with the chirping of birds. They often reminisced about their dreams of family, sharing hopes and plans for a future that seemed just within reach. "Maybe one day," Egondo said, squeezing Udenze's hand gently, "we'll have our little ones running around here, helping us on the farm." Udenze smiled, feeling warmth spread through him. "Yes, and they will learn to cherish the land just like we do." Together, they would work, talking and planning, their love as fertile as the soil they tilled. But their wait came to an end in due time. After 3 years of longing and praying, the gods finally smiled upon Udenze and Egondo. Egondo finally conceived and gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, whom they named Ifejioku, a name which means the long-awaited journey of life. Ije, as they fondly called her, was the spitting image of her mother, only more radiant. Her large, curious eyes and soft, delicate features captured the heart of everyone who laid eyes on her. The arrival of Ije brought boundless joy to their home. Udenze, overwhelmed with happiness, spared no expense in throwing a lavish naming ceremony. The feast lasted for days, with music, dancing, and endless platters of food. The village buzzed with talk of the celebration, some marveling at the generosity of Udenze, others murmuring with envy at the bright future that awaited Ije, born into the home of a prosperous father. As Ije grew, her beauty only deepened, and her laughter filled the whole house. Whenever Egondo carried her on the back to the farm, passers-by would stop to admire the child. "Ah, Udenze," they would call out, "keep my place in line, oh. This one will be my daughter-in-law one day." Udenze would chuckle, proudly puffing his chest. Ije thrived under the watchful eyes of her parents, a happy and playful child who adored the time they spent together. The family shared a peace and contentment that seemed eternal. But fate, as unpredictable as the changing seasons, had other plans. A shadow fell over their blissful life, bringing a tragedy that would forever alter Ije's path. Umwa, a village across the land, was greatly feared. Its people were known for their bloodthirsty rituals, appeasing their ancient deities with lavish human sacrifices every 10 Eke market days. These sacrifices were not just rumors, but brutal realities that left surrounding villages living in constant fear. The deities of Umwa, said to be as powerful as they were merciless, demanded lives in exchange for the village's prosperity. Over time, neighboring villages had learned to read the signs. Umwa's dark cycle of death followed a chilling, predictable pattern. Yet, even with this knowledge, there was little anyone could do to avoid their fate. The village next to Umwa had been ravaged by serial killings for years. Their men, women, and children disappearing without a trace. Fathers were now too afraid to take their sons to the farm. Mothers too fearful to let their daughters wash or bathe at the stream, lest they be snatched away as offerings of the gods. In hushed whispers, stories spread of villagers who had met untimely ends, their bodies found at the edges of sacred groves, marked with signs of ritualistic violence. Fear had become as natural as breathing for those who lived near Umwa. They knew that no one was safe. Yet, in the midst of all this, Ata village remained largely untouched by this terror. They had heard the stories, of course, but they were stories from afar, distant tales of horror that had not yet crept into their doorstep. The villagers of Ata felt secure in their belief that they were too far from Umwa's reach to become prey. That sense of safety lulled them into a false sense of security. Little did they know, Umwa's appetite for sacrifice was growing, and the villagers next to them had uncovered their pattern and found ways to avoid being haunted. Ata's time was coming, and soon they too would feel the icy grip of fear as Umwa's shadow extended towards them. Udeze and Egondo one day prepared for another day of farm work. That day, Egondo carefully packed a large basket with fruits for Ije, their little one, and a well-prepared pot of soup for herself and Udenze. With Ije securely wrapped on her back, Egondo also carried the basket of food, while Udenze took charge of the machete and other heavy tools. When they arrived at the farm, Udenze quickly cleared a spot for Egondo to set Ije down. She spread out a mat on the ground and gently placed Ije on it. She brought out some fruits from the basket, offering them to Ije, who eagerly played with them as they worked. From time to time, Udenze and Egondo would glance over and smile at Ije, making soft gestures to keep her content and prevent her from crying. Eventually, Ije grew tired and fell asleep peacefully on the mat. After working for a while, Udenze and Egondo paused to eat. All this while, Ije remained peacefully asleep. But as they ate and shared thoughts about their child, just then, Udenze and Egondo were startled by a loud scream, echoing from their neighbor's farm. Without hesitation, Udenze grabbed his machete and sprinted towards the source of the noise. Panic surged through Egondo's body as she yanked off Ije from the mat and clutched her daughter tightly in her arms. But despite the chaos, Ije remained fast asleep, undisturbed by the turmoil around her. Moments later, a gut-wrenching scream came from Udenze, his voice filled with pain. Fear gripped Egondo's heart. Whatever was happening was far more dangerous than they could handle. She had to protect Ije. Thinking quickly, she placed Ije inside the large food basket nestled by the grassy area and carefully covered it with grass, camouflaging the basket perfectly. Stepping away from the hidden basket, Egondo's pulse raised as she braced herself for whatever was coming. Her heart beat fast as she saw two hefty men approaching, their knives dripping with blood. Fear surged through her body, paralyzing her for a moment. She knew this was the end. Her eyes darted to the spot where she had hidden Ije. One final glance at her daughter before the inevitable. Without a word, one of the men raised his machete and in a swift motion slashed Egondo's throat. Blood poured on the wound as she collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The men, ruthless and focused, wasted no time. They took what they came for: her heart, her eyes, and her fingers. In their hurry, they never noticed the basket concealed in the grass, or the small peaceful presence of Ije nearby, still hidden, her life spared in the midst of the horror. The news of the brutal murder of Udenze and his family sent shock waves through the village of Ata. The once peaceful community was now gripped with fear and sorrow as whispers of ritual harvesters spread like wildfire. The villagers could not help but recall the chilling tales they heard from a traveler named Ojemba. Stories of bloodshed and disappearance, once thought distant, now tragically at their doorstep. As Udenze and Egondo's mutilated bodies were returned to the village, grief turned to dread. The village elders sought guidance from the chief priest, who declared that the bodies could not be buried in the village. The missing body parts, Egondo's heart, were signs and symbols of abominable acts, likely the work of ritual harvesters. To bury them in the village would invoke the wrath of the gods. Instead, the priest ordered that they be laid to rest at the edge of the village, far away, to prevent further misfortune. Fear tightened its grip on the hearts of the villagers. The killings were not unheard of, but this hit too close to home. Rumors swirled about the people of Umwa. Acts of this nature were attributed to them. The worst part, however, was the mystery surrounding Ije. The villagers gathered to search for the little girl, but she was nowhere to be found. Had she been taken? Was she still alive, hiding in the wilderness? The unanswered question only deepened the villagers' terror, leaving them to wonder what evil has really descended on them. After the death of Udenze's family, Ata village tightened its security. Warriors were stationed at each boundary leading into and out of the village. The paths that led to the farms and streams were heavily guarded, with warriors posted at every possible entrance. This was the first strike from Umwa, and no one knew what would come next. However, the people of Ata were ready and determined to prevent any other attack. The king of Ata issued a decree to kill any armed man found in the area that was not from Ata or a recognized warrior of the village. Any stranger entering into Ata was required to appear before the king to clarify their origin and assure the village that their presence posed no threat to the people or their safety. Fear spread throughout the kingdom. For a long time, the tragic fate of Udenze and his family lingered. Their story would not be easily forgotten. Whenever people passed by Udenze's abandoned home, they could not help but make pitiful gestures, whispering prayers under their breath. In his absence, some of his extended family seized his lands. Even if Ije, his only daughter, were to return or ever be found, she would face a bitter reality. For in the traditions of the Igbo people, only men were entitled to inherit their father's property. Being a woman, Ije would have no claim to her father's property. After countless efforts to find her, hope began to dwindle. Some villagers thought that she might have fallen prey to wild animals, while others claimed that she had been enslaved by spirits that guarded the forest. Some even speculated that the men from Umwa might have taken her as a captive, or worse, that she had been offered as a human sacrifice to appease a deity thirsty for blood. Time marched on as it always does, and the search ended. And one by one, people moved on. The once vivid story of Udenze's family began to fade slowly, sinking into the realm of forgotten tragedies. But somewhere in the wild Azuzu forest, Ije grew up peacefully. On the day of the tragedy, she was saved by Ifejioku, a priestess from Idowa village. Ifejioku was known for her ability to see visions and for exposing the corruption of the powerful elders who held sway over the village. Renowned for her strong herbal healing, she had once been respected, until the corrupt elders conspired against her and had her banished. She had lived in the wild Azusa forest for many years, far from the reach of her village. The night before the tragedy, Ifejioku had a vision of Udenze's family being slaughtered. In the vision, she saw Ije hidden in a basket of food and covered with grass. Determined to save the child, she set out from the forest in search of the place she had seen. However, by the time she arrived, the tragedy had already occurred. She found Ije in the basket, crying helplessly, her skin itchy and raw from the grass and the heat. At first, Ifejioku hesitated, thinking to leave the child behind and go back to where she had come from. But something deep inside urged her to take the girl. Looking down at the lifeless body of Egondo, she cried out, "Abomination!" With that, she turned to the basket and gently lifted Ije into her arms and cradled her close. Sinking softly, she carried the crying child through the wild forest, offering her the first bit of comfort she had felt since being hidden away. In the wild Azusa forest, Ifejioku raised Ije to be a hard-working and respectful child. She often took her along to gather leaves for herbal remedies and taught her how to prepare the medicines, how to hunt, and as well as how to blend into the forest to avoid being preyed upon by wild animals. Ifejioku treated Ije as though she were her own daughter, and Ije, believing Ifejioku to be her true mother, was deeply attached to her. Life in the wild was solitary, and Ije had no friends to play with. She even had no idea that there was a world that existed outside the forest. Her only sources of joy came from setting traps, collecting herbs, and gathering firewood for cooking. As Ije grew, she blossomed into a striking beauty with the same captivating charm her biological mother, Egondo, had possessed. Whenever she went out to pick herbs or firewood, she would sing and dance, performing the songs Ifejioku had taught her. But as time passed, Ifejioku's health began to decline. She knew her end was near. She became concerned for Ije's future and longed to take the girl out of the wild and return her to where she truly belonged. Yet, without knowing how to reunite Ije with her past, Ifejioku prayed tirelessly to the deities for guidance, hoping for a vision to lead the way. She made sacrifices and performed rituals, pleading with the gods for an answer before it was too late. One day, after finishing her chores for her mother, Ifejioku, Ije went into the forest to gather firewood as usual. As she walked, she sang and danced, her voice filling the quiet of the forest. Suddenly, she noticed two hefty men standing before her. One was strikingly handsome, dressed in fine, expensive fabrics that EJ had never seen before. The other looked like a warrior, armed and ready for battle. The men were startled at the sight of EJ. She was dressed in an animal skin, her hair so long and untamed, but still her beauty was undeniable. She looked at them strangely, never batting an eye. What is a young, beautiful girl doing alone in the Azuzu forest? The men thought. The handsome one, dressed in fine clothing, looked at her with wide eyes. She must be a god or deity, or maybe even a ghost, he whispered to the other one. My prince, the warrior said, panic in his voice. We should run. I've heard so many stories about this forest. I'm sure she's not human. Neither my arrows nor sword can fight against her. Before EJ could react, the two men bolted, fleeing deeper into the forest in their haste. They dropped a bag made of animal skin. EJ watched in confusion as they disappeared, their footsteps fading into the distance. Curious, she walked over to where their bag had fallen and picked it up. She had never seen those type of people in her life. In fact, she had never seen any other human besides her mother before. Excited by her discovery, she balanced her bundle of firewood on her head and slung the bag over her arm. She hurried home, eager to tell her mother what had just happened. When EJ reached home, she excitedly narrated the story to her mother, and together they rummaged through the bag the men had left behind. And inside, they found valuable items, cowries, neatly cut pieces of dried bushmeat, and a royal badge bearing a symbol that resembled the crest of the royal lineage of the people of Ata. Ifejioku gasped in excitement. Could this be the sign she had been waiting for all these years? She began to sing and dance, her joy infectious. EJ, caught up in the moment, looked at her mother with surprise. She had never seen her mother this happy before. This was the first time EJ had encountered anyone besides her mother, and her mind wandered back to the tall, handsome man dressed in fabrics more luxurious than anything she had ever seen. Until now, her world had consisted only of her and Ifejioku. But today, she realized that people existed beyond the wild. People who dressed in fine clothes, unlike the animal skins she had known all her life. Her curiosity grew. She bombarded her mother with questions, eager to learn more about the world beyond the forest. She longed to meet these people, to see the places they came from. She wished she could encounter the strangers again, especially the one who had caught her eye. For the first time in years, EJ felt the deep loneliness of her isolation. The forest, which had once been her entire world, now seemed so silent, so small, and so empty. Back in Ata, Prince Obiozo returned to the palace after the frantic race through the bushes, though he was still panting from exhaustion. The moment he reached the palace entrance, he composed himself, acting as though nothing had happened. Turning to his personal guard, Izundo, he said quietly, "Let's keep this between us. Speak to no one about what we saw." Izundo nodded in agreement, and together they entered the palace. King Odife, Obiozo's father, had ruled since the reign of his own father, the former king, who had overseen the kingdom during the tragic events that befell Udenze's family. King Odife had many daughters, but it wasn't until he married his second wife, Nkole, that he finally had a son, Obiozo. Obiozo was born before his grandfather's death, securing the royal lineage, just as his father had done before him. King Odife was a good ruler in every possible way. He was kind, but firm when he needed to be, and his people gave him their undying love and loyalty. And his son, Prince Obiozo, was just like him. He was known for his compassion and attentiveness to the people, and was also renowned for his handsome looks, which made the maidens of Ata eager to do anything to get his attention. Every one of them dreamed of becoming his bride. But Prince Obiozo had other concerns. He had an adventurous spirit and dreamed of going into the great Azuzu forest, where no one dared to enter. He had gone there that day to satisfy his curiosity and had seen something that his mind could not understand. That night, Obiozo could not sleep. Confusion gripped him as he lay on his bed, replaying the events of the day. But his thoughts kept returning to the beautiful maiden he had seen in the wild forest. He smiled as he remembered her face. She looked so beautiful. Her beauty was captivating. It was like nothing he had seen before. But then, a sudden realization hit him. His royal wooden badge. It had been in the bag he had flung away in their panic. His heart raced as he shot up in bed. This is a disaster. If his father discovered that he had gone into the forest, he would be in serious trouble. And worse, if it was discovered that the royal badge was missing, it would be seen as a grave sign, a potential scandal. Obiozo began pacing from one end of his room to the other, racked with anxiety. There was only one solution. He had to go back and retrieve the badge before anyone found out. No one could know. That night, Prince Obiozo did not sleep a wink. Before the first cock crowed in the early morning, he and Izundo set off, returning to the spot they had thrown the bag. Obiozo was desperate to find his wooden badge, but deep down, he longed to see Ije again, whether she was human or divine. When they reached the spot, they searched thoroughly, overturning every leaf and stone, but to no avail. Exhausted, Obiozo stood. "What if I can't find it?" he asked, his voice heavy with frustration as he glanced at Izundo. "How will I explain this to my father?" His mind raced, and then an idea sparked. "Let's split up," he said. "I go right and you go left. We will meet back here." Izundo hesitated, worry etched across his face. "I don't think that's a good idea, my prince. What if I cannot find you? The king will behead me and my entire household." Prince Obiozo signaled to Izundo with a quick glance, urging him to move to the left. Izundo sluggishly obeyed, taking a quick look back at the prince. Meanwhile, Ije was walking through the forest as usual. She had come to gather some herbs for her mother. Suddenly, she noticed the grass shifting, as if someone was heading her direction. Alarmed, she quickly hid herself in the underbrush and peered through an opening to see who else was in the forest. Her heart raced when she saw Izundo, one of the men she had encountered the last time. "Why is he here again?" she thought to herself. And then she remembered the bag. They were obviously looking for that bag. Without thinking, Ije leapt out from the hiding to startle him. Izundo, completely unprepared for her sudden appearance, stumbled backward immediately, drawing his sword in defense. His startled scream echoed through the forest, causing Prince Obiozo to rush toward him. When Obiozo arrived, he was just as surprised as Izundo to see Ije standing in front of them. Ije diverted her gaze when she saw Obiozo approach. Though Obiozo was still afraid, he knew he had to be brave if he was to retrieve his royal wooden badge. "We are not here to harm you," Obiozo said, trying to steady his voice. "We only need the bag we left behind the last time we were in the forest. I need the wooden badge. It is very important. Please, if you have it, help me." Ije looked him over from head to toe. His clothing, made from fine fabrics, was clearly expensive and of high quality. Her eyes shifted to Izundo, whose sword was still pointed at her. "If you want the badge," Ije said, her voice calm but firm, "then carry my basket and follow me." Obiozo immediately signaled Izundo to carry the basket. Ije then pointed to a path, indicating for them to lead the way. Izundo hesitated, turning to the prince Obiozo with concern. "How can we trust her?" Izundo whispered. "We don't even know if she's human." "I am human," Ije replied sharply, overhearing him and sensing their growing fear. Obiozo narrowed his eyes and pulled a small, intricately designed dagger from within his cloak. "If you are human, prove it. Take this dagger. Make a small cut on your palm. If you bleed, we'll believe you and follow your lead." Ije collected the dagger and stared at it for a moment, fascinated by its craftsmanship. She had never seen a weapon so finely made. Reluctantly, she took it and made a small cut on her palm. She winced in pain as the blood trickled from the wound. Both Obiozor and Izundo stood wide-eyed, their jaws slightly open in disbelief. She was human after all. But as they watched her bleed, a new question haunted them. What was she doing alone in the forest? Ije led the way, with Izundo and Prince Obiozor following closely behind. They walked through the grassy forest, their steps careful and measured, until they arrived at a small hut, standing alone in the middle of the path. Both men stopped, staring in shock at the sight of the isolated dwelling. The smell of herbs filled the air around them. Ije gestured for them to sit, then called out to her mother. Moments later, Ifejioku emerged weakly from the hut. Obiozor and Izundo were stunned, realizing that Ije wasn't living alone in the forest, just as they had thought. Ifejioku looked them over, then began singing softly, her voice wavering. After a few moments, she stopped and said, "You are from Ata, are you not?" Obiozor and Izundo nodded, confirming her guess. "You've traveled far to get here," she added with a faint smile. "Give them some food," she said to Ije. "No," Prince Obiozor interrupted sharply. "We must leave quickly before it's too late. I only need the wooden badge that was inside the bag she picked up. It is very important to me and to the entire royal family." Ifejioku smiled again, this time with a knowing look, and began to sing her soft folk song once more, repeating the same tune. After a moment, she signaled to Ije to retrieve the bag. Ije stood and fetched the bag and handed it over to Obiozor. As he took it, he found himself staring at her. The more he looked at her, the more her beauty captivated him. Ifejioku, still weak but observant, broke the silence. "See them off," she said to Ije, her voice gentle. Ije walked with the two men through the forest, silent and steady. When they reached the spot where they had first encountered her, she turned to leave, but Obiozor stopped her. "I'm sorry about your hand," he said, his voice sincere. "Is there anything I can do to make it up to you for the pain I caused?" Ije paused, considering his offer. Finally, she smiled and replied, "Bushmeat." Obiozor was taken aback by the simplicity of the request. But then, he noticed the way her eyes lingered on his clothing, clearly admiring the fine material. "I'll bring you bushmeat," he said with a smile, "and good fabric too. I'll return in 3 market days." As they parted ways, Obiozor found himself smiling. When they were out of sight, Ije hurried back home to tend to her sick mother. After this second encounter with Ije, Prince Obiozor found himself increasingly curious about her. He smiled to himself whenever she crossed his mind. and often reminisced about their previous encounter. Obiozor meticulously selected the best fabric and beads for her, enlisting Izundu's help. "She will look even more beautiful wearing these," he said to him. Izundu, Obiozor's childhood friend and personal guard, noticed the prince's growing obsession. It was clear something had changed in him. Almost every conversation eventually led back to Ije, no matter how hard Izundu tried to steer it elsewhere. Prince Obiozor eagerly counted the days, each one feeling longer as he anticipated seeing Ije again. Meanwhile, in the forest, Ifejioku's health continued to worsen. She knew it was time to tell Ije the truth. One night, after their dinner of well-prepared porridge yam, they sat by the fire. Ifejioku had made up her mind to tell Ije the truth of her past, and without warning, she spoke before she would change her mind. "Ije, my child, I know you have always wondered how we came to live here, even though you hide it. I see it in your eyes. Tonight, I want to tell you something I have never told you before. Your father's name is Udenze, and your mother's name is Egondo." Ije froze, her heart racing as the words sank in. She stared at Ifejioku, shocked by the sudden revelation. Ifejioku began to tell her the story of her real parents, how they were murdered, and how she had found Ije lying in a basket. "Your village is Ata," she added, her voice weak and punctuated by a slight cough. Tears welled up in Ije's eyes as she listened to the tragedy that had befallen her parents. Her heart was filled with gratitude to this kind woman who had saved her. "I don't have much time left, Ije. I want you to go back to Ata. There, you will live the kind of life that you truly desire." The prospect of returning to Ata thrilled Ije, but there's no way she was leaving her mother behind. "No, mother," Ije replied amidst sobs. "I'll take you to Ata, and we'll find a good herbalist. You'll get better," she pleaded, her voice trembling with emotion. Ifejioku laughed. "The gods decide where a person's journey ends, Ije," she replied, her tone resigned. She reached beside her mat and pulled out an old worn wrapper. "This belonged to your mother. She placed it in the basket with you." Ije took the piece of cloth and held it to her chest, her silent sobs barely audible over the crackling fire. Ifejioku reached out and found Ije's hand, squeezing it gently. "You have been more than a daughter to me," Ifejioku whispered. "The light you brought into my wretched life kept me alive. Because of you, I've known what it is to truly live." She coughed again, her breathing shallow. Ifejioku spoke her blessings over Ije, her voice soft and filled with love. The day had finally come for Prince Obiozor to visit Ije again, and he could not contain his excitement. He dressed in his finest fabric, eager to impress her. As he and Izundu made their way through the grassy forest, carrying the items they prepared for her. Despite the complexity of the forest, Obiozor and Izundu easily followed the path, guided by the memory of Ije leading them the last time. When they arrived at Ije's hut, her face lit up with joy, her heart racing with excitement when she saw them. She examined each of the gifts Obiozor had brought when he gave it to her. Fine fabrics, beautiful beads, and plenty of bushmeat, both roasted and live. Smiling from ear to ear, she eagerly showed off the gifts to her mother, Ifejioku, who lay weakly on a mat, but smiled at her daughter's happiness. Ije decided to prepare a meal with the fresh bushmeat. She cooked a delicious soup, and they all sat together and ate. The atmosphere was filled with warmth and contentment. All the while, Obiozor could not take his eyes off Ije. Her smile captivated him like nothing else ever had. He had never felt this kind of connection to any maiden before. Something about her called out to him. It was as if they were meant to be. It was as if their meeting was orchestrated by fate. Back at home, there were lots of beautiful maidens eager to be his. But this bright-eyed beauty in the wild forest had captured his heart in ways he had never known it was possible. That day marked the beginning of something new for both Prince Obiozor and Ije. As the evening came to a close, it was time for Obiozor and Izundu to leave. Ije's heart sank at the thought of them going, and her face showed her disappointment. But Obiozor, sensing her feelings, made light-hearted, playful gestures that brought a smile back to her face. He took her hand as they walked toward the part of the forest where they usually said their goodbyes. Before leaving, Obiozor turned to Ije, his voice gentle but firm. "I will return, I promise. And next time, I will take you to see Ata." Ije's spirits lifted slightly at his words, her smile returning. She watched as he and Izundu disappeared into the forest, waving until they were out of sight. With a heart full of mixed emotions, she returned home to be with her mother, holding on to the hope that Obiozor would keep to his promise. Ije knew she had grown fond of Obiozor. Whenever he was around, there was a sense of happiness that filled her heart, something she could not fully explain. His presence brought warmth and joy, and when he left, it was as though a shadow of loneliness had fallen over her. The silence of the forest suddenly seemed louder, and the absence of his voice and laughter left her feeling hollow. If it were possible, Ije wished she could see Obiozor every day, or better yet, live to be with him. She longed for the connection they had, and her heart ached in his absence. Each day, she hoped and prayed that Obiozor would visit soon, her thoughts constantly drifting back to him. But back in Ata, a dreadful sickness had broken out. Children fell ill, and the elders desperately sought solutions. The village was in chaos, but the royal household was sealed off by guards, preventing anyone from entering until a cure was found. Many herbalists were summoned. Some offered temporary relief, but after 3 days, the sickness would return with the same intensity. The symptoms were severe: violent vomiting, high fevers, and extreme weakness due to dehydration. The king, Odife, searched tirelessly for a solution, but hope began to dwindle when Prince Obiozor himself became infected. His health deteriorated quickly, much like the others, recovering briefly, only to fall ill again after 3 days. Izundu watched helplessly as his friend Obiozor grew weaker by the day, barely able to stand or eat, his life hanging by a thread. As a result, he could not keep his promise to visit Ije. With each passing day, it became clear that he would not survive without help. Izundu, desperate to save his friend, suddenly recalled the distinct herbal scent from Ije's hut. He thought of her mother, Ifejioku, who might possess the healing knowledge they needed. Ije herself had shown an understanding of herbs. Perhaps they could help, he thought to himself. Determined, Izundu set out into the grassy forest to find Ije. When he reached her hut, Ije was thrilled to see him, but her joy quickly turned to disappointment when she realized Obiozor was not with him. Izundu explained the dire situation in Ata, pleading for her help. He described the prince's deteriorating health and begged Ifejioku and Ije to come to Obiozor's aid. Ifejioku, sensing that the time had come for Ije to return to her people, agreed to help. They offered Izundu a place to rest for the night, and by the first light, they would set out for Ata. As Ije packed, her heart raced with fear for Obiozor's life. She prayed fervently to the gods, pleading for his survival. That night, Ifejioku helped Ije prepare herbs. "This is your path, my child," she whispered as she looked into her daughter's eyes, her tone filled with both pride and sorrow. Before the first cock crowed, Ije and Izundu were ready to leave. She dressed in the fine apparel Obiozor had bought for her, determined to look her best as she stepped into Ata. But when Ije went to bid her mother farewell, she found that Ifejioku had already passed in the night. Grief overwhelmed her, and she collapsed in tears, her heart shattered. Izundu gently helped her to bury her mother within the hut, a final resting place for the woman who had raised her. With a heavy heart, Ije departed for Ata, knowing that her journey was just beginning. Izundu and Ije arrived at the palace at sunset, their journey through the forest now behind them. As they stood before King Odife, Izundu quickly explained who Ije was and how he and the prince had once met her mother, Ifejioku, a skilled herbalist. King Odife, cautious about those who entered the palace, studied Ije with a calm but curious expression. "Where are you from, my child?" the king asked gently. Ije hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding, before replying, "I am Ije. My late father's name was Mazi Udenze, and my mother's name was Egondu. I am from Ata." The king's face froze in shock. Izundu too stood in disbelief. The name Udenze resonated deeply within the royal household and the entire Ata at large. "I was raised in the forest by my mother, Ifejioku, who saved me after my parents were killed," Ije continued. The king nodded, piecing it together. "Now I understand. The more I look at you, the more you resemble your mother, Egondu," he said softly, his voice tinged with sadness. "It grieves me that we must welcome you back under such difficult circumstances." The king turned to Izundu. "Arrange a room for her in the palace and bring her to Opiozo quickly to begin treatment." When Ije entered the prince's chamber, she found him weak and barely conscious, his once strong body ravaged by illness. But when Obiozo saw her, a flicker of life returned to his eyes. Ije's heart ached for him, and without wasting time, she set to work. She prepared mixtures of potent herbs, making him drink some and inhale the rest. Her hands worked with precision, guided by the knowledge passed down from Ifejioku. By dawn, to everyone's amazement, Prince Obiozo was able to stand. The king and his elders were astonished by Ije's herbal skills, and word quickly spread throughout the kingdom. The palace gates were opened and villagers brought their sick to Ije for healing. Her remedies worked wonders, and unlike before, the sickness did not return. To celebrate, the king organized a grand feast in Ije's honor, welcoming her back to her people in the most joyful way. The villagers rejoiced, grateful for her healing touch, and the festive drums echoed through the village. As the celebration continued, the king approached Ije with a smile. "You have done us a great service, my child. Ask for any gift, and it will be yours," he offered graciously. Ije hesitated, unsure of what to ask. She looked around the festive grounds, her eyes wandering until they settled on Obiozo. The king noticed the direction of her gaze and exchanged knowing glances with the elders. "Do you desire Obiozo as a reward for your help?" the king asked, his voice gentle but amused. Ije's face flushed with embarrassment. She hadn't meant to make such a bold request, and she was unsure if it was even proper to ask for a prince in return for her deeds. Before she could respond, Obiozo smiled at her, but the king interrupted her thoughts. "In our tradition, it is the man who chooses a bride," the king continued. "But if Obiozo wishes to marry you, we would all be pleased. We all know your father, and he was a respected member of this great community. It pained our hearts the way he was tragically killed, and we have searched for you for years, to no avail." Without hesitation, Obiozo spoke. "I choose Ije as my bride." The villagers erupted in cheers, the joy of the festival amplified by the announcement. The drums beat louder, and the celebration carried on with even more fervor. The other maidens were green with envy. "We have known him all our lives, and yet he chooses this classless thing," they gossiped among themselves, their voices filled with venom. Immediately, the wedding preparations started. The village buzzed with excitement as the day drew nearer. For them, it was not just a matter of the prince taking a wife. It was a celebration for the daughter they had thought lost. Udenze's relatives in particular were over the moon with joy. The gods had returned a part of their brother to them after they had lost hope of ever finding her. Ije's heart was filled with joy, but in all the excitement, something was missing. She wished her mother Ifejioku was there to share this joy with her. But somewhere deep in her heart, she knew that her mother was with her. Since her return to Ata, she had heard a lot of stories about her real parents and the love they had shared. Her curious mind wanted to see where she was born and lived with her parents. And so, one morning, Prince Obiozo took her to the place which had once been her home. The place had remained untouched, just as it was from the day her parents were killed. Immediately she stepped into the compound, she felt a deep sense of belonging. "This is home," she whispered to herself. Although she had no memory of her parents, but she knew that here she was loved. A few weeks later, Obiozo and Ije were married in a grand ceremony, their union bringing happiness not just to themselves, but to the entire kingdom. Together, they lived long and fulfilled lives. And when the king passed, Obiozo stepped in to fill his father's shoes as the new king of Ata. And his beautiful wife, Ije, took her place beside him as his queen. And together, they ruled the people of Ata with love. Hey lovers, thank you for listening to this story. If you're new here, welcome to our community. I hope you enjoyed listening to this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you have not done so already, please hit the subscribe button, and to support the growth of our community, give this video a big thumbs up. If you have learned something, please let us know in the comment section. And if you know someone who needs this story, do not hesitate to share. I'll take my leave now, but I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.